All right, good evening. This is Adam Buckner, and this is another wonderful installment of Unity Technologies live training here on both our website and direct through Twitch. All right, so what are we doing today? Well, this is another live training, but this is going to be a continuation of making a generic modal window. We've made 2 episodes on this so far. And so this is going to be enigmatically a part 3. What are we going to do in today's session? Well, part of this is to do the last final step of optimization and also to address some concerns that people had brought up over the last couple of weeks since we presented parts 1 and part 2. One of the main things that I'd like to do in tonight's session is to be able to show at least the beginning framework of pushing all of the content that we have to the modal window. And also I want to talk about code optimizations and also some trade-offs in where you want to have your code overhead. So this is the system that we have set up in the last 2 sessions. We've got a modal panel, which is normally deactivated. And also I want to be aware about being a true modal panel. We aren't actually pausing the game. We do talk about a pause menu in another session. So this is purely the UI tool part of it. But this does block out clicks and connections so that when we've got the modal window up, we block out being able to click underneath it. And this is normally hidden, and this is brought up by our test objects, and we can push different Unity actions which will go to the buttons on-click event. So if we look at the yes button or the no button, we've got an on-click event, and our code will push the function pointer, the Unity action, into the on-click event so that we can vary whatever we want this window to do. So we've got one window, we can push multiple buttons to it, 1, 2, or 3 buttons. And when the button is clicked, we can push to it any function pointer for any function that we have in our game that's viable. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off the modal window again. So that's what we're doing. And then over here on the upper left is where we have our little test buttons. And these are test objects down here. And the one thing I'm going to do is we're going to need one more button. So I'm just going to go ahead and make it now. I'm going to go ahead and duplicate that. Call this test. Let's get rid of the 1. Come on, we can do it. Test CI button, because what I want to have is a button that has an icon as well. And we'll move that up. And you can see this is automatically resizing because we've got layout groups on it. And so let me change that name on our label to from cancel test to cancel test with icon. How about that? Cancel test with icon. We'll see that later on. I just wanted to go ahead and get that out of the way. So why don't we just dive in? Because this is a continuation, I'm going to assume that you have watched parts 1 and 2. If you haven't, well then just follow along as best as possible and then go ahead and grab those off of the archive sites. They're already up on YouTube and they're available in our live training archive. Let's take a look at our scripts. This is mostly going to be a script-heavy episode. So we've got our modal panel script, and our modal panel has some quick references to the UI elements on that panel, including the question text, an icon image, and our 3 buttons, yes, no, and cancel, and then also the modal panel itself, which we can use for turning on and off the object. We also have a static sort of singleton-like reference so that we can easily get a hold of that modal panel from other parts of our game. And then we have a series of overloaded functions for all of our different possible combinations. I mean, do we have an icon or not? Are we using 1 button or 2 or 3? And so essentially we have 6 overloads with this, which is with and without a button, and then up to 3 events, which is a little bit heavy on our modal panel script. So one of the things that we can do to simplify this is that we can use what is known as optional parameters. And so this will be able to simplify some of our code. We're going to get even more simple later on. What we can do, I'm going to comment out this one, the choice that takes a question, a string, and a single event. And I'm going to just let's comment that out. And then I'm going to work directly here on. Oops, have I commented? Not enough is what I did. Now, in our choice, we've got a string question, a sprite icon image, and a Unity action. So just one button at this point. And I want to make this as an optional sprite. So we can spend the sprite as an optional one. So let's go ahead and create, for an optional parameter, what you can do is set a value for what will happen if this parameter does not being sent. Now, what I've just written is almost correct, but it is actually wrong. This looks correct. You know, I've made an optional parameter here, and I've said if we don't get sprite icon, it's going to be null. This is wrong, but I'll show you the error in a second, because I want to show you how this will error out, and then we'll go ahead and we'll fix it. And then what I can do is change. We've got this icon image dot sprite equals the icon image that comes in. We can just make this a conditional and just say if we have it, if icon image. If icon image, then we'll take this icon image dot sprite and set it to the icon image. So essentially, if it's null, we won't get our null reference. And then we need to do one other thing, which is that we don't want to set that game object, that sprite game object being true, unless it's actually there. So again, we want to do that same thing, where we want to say if icon image, and paste that in. So if icon image, this icon dot game object that's set active true, or else we want to take, and then we will set that to false. There we go, false. So let's save this. And let's come back to Unity. And we have an error. And the optional parameter cannot precede required parameters. And so we'll see how this is going to become an issue a little bit later on and what our solution is for it. Currently, the first way we can solve this is simply make sure that we reorder our sprite. So we'd grab our sprite and yeah. And X, please, and we can move it to the end. Now we're going to have to go and reorder our tests that call it. So let's save this. And our test modal panel, we've got our C, and we have our test cancel, test C, and our test cancel with icon. And now the only big difference is the one with the icon. We just need to reorder that. Oh, sensitive mouse. Come on. And put that at the end. So now we've just simply reordered the we've reordered our arguments to match the signature, our parameters in the function that we have. So let's save this and come back to Unity with the correct keys, and we should see that go away. And now if we go ahead and we play, we can do our test. You know, this is an announcement. If you don't like it, shove off, cancel, and then there's our text without the icon. Oh, that's because we didn't add it in. Yes, we need an icon for that. So let's grab our images, our sprites. Where did I put our icon? Ornaments. Zomlerps goes into the icon so that we actually have an icon to use. And we've done it in play mode. So let's try that again when we are not in play mode. So there's a text CI. Let's go ahead and Zomlerps goes in there. So let's save this and hit play. And then we should see that, yeah, that's working. And then with the icon, it's not. When I duplicated the button, I didn't redo the function. So test modal, I have it pointing to the wrong one. That's it. And I've done it again while we're in play mode. So let's go ahead and test modal panel C. So let's save that and hit play. And there's our icon. There we go. Cool. Sorry about that. So we can simplify. We've now removed from our modal panel, we've been able to cut out one of these overloads. So we don't need that one. So that's just gone. But we still have a ton more. And we also want to be able to send more information. We want to break out of this yes, no, cancel setup, and we want to start having generic buttons that we can send any detail to. We want to send any background to. We want to send any label to. So the first thing I want to do is go ahead and refactor my buttons. And so let's change them from the yes, no, and cancel button to just simply button 1, and then button 2, and then a button 3. So we've now changed the names just so they're more generic. And this will break the way that we've set up the references in Unity. So we're going to have to go into Unity and re-reference those. So let's cut back to Unity. And while we're here, let's also change the names here and refactor these. Let's just call these button 1. And then, there we go, button 2. And then button 3. And because we've renamed the variables in our script, we also need to re-reference them here. So let's go ahead and drag these over. So we now have button 1. Oops, wrong one. Sensitive mouse. Button 2. And button 3. So essentially that's just redoing what we've done before. Now I also want to be able to change these labels. And we could try to grab these from code, but I think it's going to be easier to just simply do this in edit time and make a public variable for it, because we could grab these on the fly, but the game object is going to be inactive when we first look at it in start, when we start the game, and trying to grab that inactive game object is a little bit difficult when you're dealing with getting components in the children. And we could grab these references once we've activated the button, and we'd have to do that every time we called that particular button. But, that just seems a little bit overly complicated when we can simply write public button and then associate it in the editor. So let's quickly write public text, and let's call this button 1 text, probably would be a good way. Button 1 text, and then let's copy that, and then paste. And then we'll change these to 2 and 3, 2 and 3. So we now have a public button 1, button 2, and button 3 text. So let's go ahead and save this, and then again, we're going to be referencing that in the editor. So when that pops up, we can see that we have our text. So let's go ahead and just associate those labels. So coming back to our code, we now want to pass information to the button. And that will take more than just simply that action. We want to send a label, we might want to send a background image, and we want to send the action. And so one of the easiest ways to do this is to make another class. I mean, we could probably make a struct, but I'm just going to go ahead and make another public class. So make a public class, and then let's call this event button details. And these event button details, we just simply want a public string for the button title, a public sprite. We're probably not going to use this today, but you can get an idea of how this would work. A button background, because you'll see when we do this how easy it would be to set that up. And then a public Unity action, and we'll just call that our action. And just to be clear, so we know what we're dealing with, is that we'll probably not implement this today. Now that we have our button details, how are we going to pass this efficiently without having a lot of overloads to our modal window? Now, having a lot of overloads is not necessarily the wrong way to go. And I'm going to show you a way, or several ways, that we can avoid having all of these extra overloads, but I'm not trying to come across that this is the only way to do it, and having a lot of overloads is necessarily wrong. Having a lot of overloads like this is efficient, it's easy to write, you know where they are, The problem that I have with it is that if you're maintaining your code and you have, at this point, 6, now we can probably try to cut it down to 3 or less overloads, and you make an update, you have to remember to properly update all of the overloaded functions. And so don't take it that I'm saying that you shouldn't have overloaded functions, but I do want to show you some options on some other ways that you can do stuff. So let's create a new choice. And the reason I want to change this is that partly not to break absolutely everything that we're working on, and also partly so we can see if it does break, and just to give us a brand new slate to come from. But I mean, I could make this and just call this choice and then delete all of the choices that we don't need. But let's just call this new choice. We could, in its signature, have our string and let our string question that we want to be the question that we're asking. And then we could use params. We could use params, and I'll explain that in just a second. And we could call these event button details, and we can call this button details. We aren't going to do this, though. We aren't going to use this, and this is ignoring the sprite for a moment. Now, params will allow us to send any number of event button details to this function, and we could send as many event button details as we needed, and then we could go through the list that we get in the function and figure out what we want to do with those event button details. But there are some drawbacks to this. We don't want an infinite number of arguments. Because we have 3 buttons in this case, we don't want the ability to send 30 or 40 button details. And so we'd have to write code that would catch this. You might end up playing rounders or cricket or baseball, where you're throwing errors and catching them and trying to figure out why the arguments are larger than you need, and to be able to send a proper message back to the caller by saying, you sent us more arguments than we need in this case. Also, params is slower than our overloads. Params will be making a temporary array to be able to hold all of these. Now, in this case, we're probably not doing a lot with our game. We're pausing the game. There's not a heck of a lot going on. We're not in the middle of combat, so it may not be a big deal, but params are slower. Also, it's potentially opening up with that temp array, and not only a little bit of slower, but also it could add some more pressure onto garbage collection. Though params are very good for making frameworks, because you make a very neutral framework, a generic framework, and you allow the caller, the person using the framework, the versatility to send an unknown amount of params. I don't think this is really what I want to do in this particular case. So we're not going to do this, but I did want to cover params and what params were, and briefly how to use them. So if you want to know more about params, go ahead and look that up, at MSDN or Stack Overflow or that sort of thing. But realize that it will allow you to put in any number of event button details or of that particular type. And it must be the last thing in the signature of the function. Now, the other thing we could do is we could just try to make an array and make that array ourselves and send that array into this new choice function. But it has many of the similar problems that we have with params. We can't really limit the number of arguments that are coming in. We don't want an undefined number of arguments. It also has the potential of being slower. It has the potential of the garbage collection issues. So we can write our series of overloads, and I think it's a good thing to think of, that you can write your overloads. But let's take a look at another option, which is that we could send in a number of optional event button details. We can have one event button detail, and let's just call this button 1 details. And then after that, we can have some event button details, and we can call this button 2 details. And if it doesn't arrive, it equals null. And then let's just go ahead and go for the whole hog and get that third one, event button details, and then let's call that button 3 details. One of the problems I have with this, though, not only is it a tad bit ugly, what do we do about our sprite? We ignored the sprite when we were talking about params. I don't really want to ignore the sprite now, is that we could have that optional sprite that we had before, our sprite icon, sprite, and that's our sprite, and that's our icon image equals null. But we run into a little bit of a twisty-turny problem. We're in a cave of twisty passages. We're in a twisty passage of caves. You must fill in your optional parameters from left to right. And here we might want to have an optional sprite, and we might want to have an optional event button detail. And this doesn't work for both. Now, if we just had event button details and we weren't sure how many buttons we wanted, we could simply do this. You know, send 1, send 2, send 3. And if we only sent 1, we use 1 button. If we sent 2 or 3, we use the 2 or 3 buttons. But we also want to have that option for our sprite. We also might want to have other options. We might want to have optional backgrounds. Who knows what options we want. So without using overloads, we need to pass in a class. Let me just go ahead and clear this out. It's a bit big. And realign that. We need to make a new class. A new public class. And let's call this one modal panel details. And let's make this up. Again, we'll make it a little bit bigger than we're going to use today, but to give you an idea of where you can go with this, let's make a public string, and let's just call this one the title. We don't have a title, so this is also going to be not implemented. But right now that window only just has a question and 3 buttons, but you could imagine having a title on top and then the question, and so that you can have more detail inside our modal window. And then there's the, how about the public string, which is our question. Then we can have a public sprite, which would be our icon image, which we have our zomlerps for. We could also make another sprite just for the fun of it, which would be our panel background image, which we also are not going to implement today. But you'll be pretty obvious to show how to do that, how to implement that, so that you can completely refactor the look of that modal window depending on what you want to do. So you still have that same one modal window, you just simply send it the references that it needs. And then we need to have our event button details. So we want our public event button details, and then we would want that to be our button 1 details, just like we had in the parameters list. Let me copy this. And then let's paste this a couple times. And then we'll, of course, adjust those. So we've got our 3 event button details. So now we have our modal panel details, and you can see that they use those event button details, and we only have 3. So we can only have up to 3 event button details. So we've limited the number of buttons in the modal panel details that matches the modal panel that we have. If you ended up making a modal panel with more buttons, then make one with more details. But this will allow us to control what we pass into our function. So let's come back down to our new choice. And when we are doing our new choice, we simply need to pass in our modal, only if we spell it correctly, our modal panel details. And let's just call this something simply like details. So now we've simplified that parameters list down to just one class that we pass. And we're going to be making something very similar to the ones that we have around, that we have in our overloads. So let's do some copying and pasting. So let's copy and paste. The first thing we're going to do is set that modal panel object. We're going to set that modal panel object to being active, to true. And then when we look at the way that we've set up the other overloads, we've been turning on and off our buttons, you know, based on which particular overload we're in. But I want to go ahead and do this in a little bit more a safer, somewhat safer manner. So let's just simply take the icon and take all three buttons and then simply turn them all off. So we now have that modal panel object. It's on. We've now turned everything off. So we've turned off the icon. We have turned off all three buttons. And then let's go ahead and set our question. So again, let's copy this and paste that in. So our this question.text equals the question, but we now need to make this not just the question, but details.question. So we're going to grab the question that has come in from our details. And then, like we have up here, if we have our icon image, we want to set it and set it active. So we sort of want to have both of these here. So if we have our icon image, whoa, come on, true. There we go. So if we have our icon image, then we make that icon image to be true. We set it active to be true, and we also set that icon image itself. But again, it's going to come from our details. So our details.iconImage. I'm sure that the smart people here have already begun to see the pattern that we're doing. So there'll be a little bit of boilerplate as I dig through this. And then we would then want to set our buttons, our on-click. So again, our button 1, we want to do that same thing that we have down here. We want to take that button 1 on click. We want to remove all listeners, and then we want to add our listener and our close panel. But again, we don't want it to be our yes event. It's going to be our add listener is going to come from our details dot button 1 details. This is from the first button that we have. And then we're going to add our action to it. So we remove all the listeners just like we did before. We go ahead and we add our action that comes in from our details.button 1 details into the action, and then we add our close panel. Then what we've added is we want to have our button 1 text. And we want the button 1 text.text to be equal to our details, button 1 details, and that is our button title. And lastly, we want to set active true on that button 1. So now we've done, this is really obvious what we've done here. We've, if we have that icon that's optional, the icon will be turned on. So the question is definitely required. The icon is optional. The button 1 is required. We have to have at least one button, but then we've got 2 optional buttons after that. So essentially we want to say is if we have details dot button details 2, button 2 details, it's not equal to null. Then we want to essentially do all of this again. Except we want to do this with button 2. Oops. Do I have that right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yep. 1, 2, 3, 4. I've missed something. Nope. 1. Remove all listeners. Yeah, I did miss one. There should be 5 of those. So we want to remove the listeners, we want to add the listeners, but we also want to make sure that all of this is refactored to button 2. saves us typing it all in, and that is including the ones that we have hiding here. And again, lastly, if we've got that third button, okay, there we go. Button 1, button 2, button 3, and then quickly we'll change these to button 3 all the way through. Why did that? Oh, there's one that's not 2. 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2. Okay, and let's grab these. 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, and 3, and 3. So those are our 3 buttons. This is essentially all we need. So we can save this. Now I'm going to quickly check back with Unity, because I don't like the fact that that one's red, and see what Unity has to say in the console, which is bitter. Okay, I've missed something. Ah, there we go, missing semicolon. There we go. Pow. All right, that is compiled. So now to test this, let's go back and we need to change what we're doing in our test modal panel window. So these are our test functions. And what you'll see is what we've done, we've removed all of the overloads to one function, but it's going to put a little more overhead onto the caller, the function that's calling it. These test functions are very, very simple right now because they can target exactly which overload they want. But we're going to get a little bit deeper because of the way that we've set this up. Also, partly because we're sending more information. We need to send the text, which we need to send to the button label. Potentially, though, we're not going to implement it, the background. So let's go ahead and update our test C and nuke that out. We will need to have our modal panel details. We have to send modal panel details to this function. So we're going to need, let's just call this modal panel details. And they're going to be equal to new modal panel details. So they're equal to our new modal panel details. So we've created a new one. And I'll show you some things that will make this a little bit more compact as we get further forward. And so we want to take our modal panel details. Let's try that again. Modal panel details. Whoops. There we go. Modal panel details dot question. And that's going to be equal to the same thing that we had before down here. This is an announcement. And if you don't like it, shove off. So, same text. And then our button needs to be our modal panel details button 1 detail is going to be equal to new event button detail. And I'm going to set this in a straightforward manner. I'm going to show you a slightly different way of doing this in just a second. Our modal panel details. Button 1 details, button title is going to be equal to, let's make it something different. Let's call it gotcha. Gotcha, I gotcha. Understood. And then you can see how this puts a little bit more overhead here in this step, modal panel details dot button 1 details. And then we have our action. And that's going to be the same thing as we've done before. And that's going to be our test cancel function. And then lastly, we actually have to send it to our modal panel, new choice. And then we just send our modal panel details. And I'm sure when you're not teaching someone, you can come up with slightly smaller names for that. So let's save that. Now, what does Unity say? Unity says yes. Cool. Now let's give our option with our test C, with our test cancel with our icon. And again, we just need exactly the same content, except we need that one extra line. So we have the same as our test cancel, except we have an icon now, which we can do before the anywhere in here is fine, but let's just do it in the same order that they're on the modal panel. And let's say modal panel details dot icon image equals our icon. So now we have, oh, and I put it in the wrong one. Bother. Let's put that down here. Okay, and save that. Now, this is a bit bulky. A bit bulky, but not bad. It works. One of the ways that we can tighten this up so it's not so many lines of code, where we're saying we declare that our button details equals new event button details, and then we go through each one and we create our icon, our title, our action. Now we could go and write a custom constructor for it, because we don't want to fill out all of our options. But then again, we're trying to sort of narrow down how much code we're going to write. We would then might have to go into our class and write a custom constructor for each of our possibilities. And again, I'm not necessarily recommending thoroughly best practices, but I'm recommending options that will simplify the amount of code that we're going to write. So we've gone into our modal panel and gotten it down to one function instead of 6 or 8 overloads. And now I want to not write lots of different types of constructors. And we can do this with a thing called an initializer list. And we can, while we're creating our new, say, event button details, is we can then make a custom initializer at the same time. And interestingly enough, with this form, because we're not going to be making multiple constructors that we're attaching, we can get rid of the parentheses and we can put in curly brackets. And in that event button details, we're going to be putting in all of the information that we have down here. So what we can do is say our new event button details, our icon image. I'm just going to go ahead and lay this out in a chunk, just delete the in-between, and I'll put the rest of the stuff back at the end. So our icon image equals the icon. And you notice that we're using the name. We are using a title here. The button title is gotcha. And the action is our test cancel function. And then we put in our final curly bracket. And we can actually do this. Have I put the I've got the icon in the wrong place. And I've added it into the wrong chunk. So let's get rid of that, because we're not sending the icon to the button. We can do that up here. So let's go ahead and do this again here, where we've got our new modal panel details, and we get rid of that. And we say our question is equal to, this is an announcement. And our icon is equal to our icon image. Okay, now where were we? So we've got our tests CI, and we can see that simplified with the, let's move that over. It's been simplified with the initializer list, and we can also see that the modal panel details button is working with that initializer list. What about these lambdas? Let's go ahead and look at the one at the bottom, our test lambda 3. It's also one of the reasons why I was trying not to zoom in too far. I'm going to zoom you guys out again. One chunk, maybe. We'll see. It's just that it's a long function. So again, this was going into a special overload that would take the arguments that we're putting here. So let's go ahead and rewrite this one as well and try to keep it as compact as possible. So all right, I'll try to zoom in for you guys again. See if that'll make a difference when we're a little shorter here. We want our modal panel detail, and let's just call this modal panel details, and that's going to be equal to a new modal panel details, and our question is going to be equal to again, the ones we had down here. Do you want to spawn 3 spheres? And then our modal panel details dot button 1 details is going to be equal to a new event button details. And that's going to be our button title. It's going to be equal to something like yes, please. And then our action is going to be equal to the same thing, which we can just snap that lambda straight up. Yeah. And we do have to watch the fiddly syntax that we have here, because this ends up having lots of curly brackets and lots of odd semicolons, and they all have to be in the right place. And so we want 2 buttons here. So we've got our modal panel details dot button 2 details. Let's do that in 2, please. Button 2 details equals also a new event button details. And that's going to be our button title. Is going to be equal to no thanks, something like that. And our action is going to be equal to our test no function. And lastly, we will have our modal panel dot new choice, and we'll send it our modal panel details. Now we try one more time. Oh, victory! Look at that. Let's go ahead and see if this tests. So in theory, we should get our cancel test. Oh, okay, that shouldn't have any image there. There's our image. So we got to find out what we've done wrong. Why the cancel test now has an image. And then our lambda test has an image as well. So we've got something going wrong. Let me quickly figure out what we've got going on. Is it double checking what I wrote there? It's because icon images doesn't have its details. That was when I copied it over. So that should be details.icon image. So there is probably there is an icon image in the script. So it's finding that. Sorry, I like that. It's finding the icon image there, and it's blank. So now we have to make sure that when we made that into details, once we wrapped it in a class, we have to make sure that the class there is in the front. So let's save that. Let's come back to Unity. Use the right keys, please. And then now, there we go. And cancel test with icon. And then our lambda 3 test. Oops. Thing to spawn. Okay. So probably when I upgraded to 5, we don't have thing to spawn, which is our sphere. So let's add our sphere in there. So we've just got a missing reference. So let's save that and hit our thing to spawn. There we go. Guess we lost that when we upgraded from 5, because so we've upgraded from 5 since we saw that last. So that's the class. So that's it. The things that I wanted to show you here was, one is that partly because a lot of people were asking me, how could I push different information to that button where we left off last time? They wanted to know how to easily push different information here to yes, no, cancel. And so hopefully I've been able to show that. That's relatively simple. You just need the reference that you need to the label. You just need more arguments that you send in general going to the items. And we can do that if you see that with the way that we've grabbed the buttons and the button text, we can also grab the button's sprite for the background. We could grab the background to the modal panel itself, to that image. Also, the other questions that I was getting about this was, how could it be more efficient? It seemed to be relatively heavy in the amount of lines of code that we were writing. But I think the first thing that we have to realize is that the number of lines of code isn't necessarily bad practice. And the fact that we had a number of overloaded functions, one for every one of the possibilities that we could have, with and without the icon, and up to, in this case, 3 buttons. So in this particular example, we only had 6 choices. It at least fits the bill relatively exactly. You have exactly what you need for the choices that you have. But as an option, as options of bringing that amount of code down, is that we've gone from, around 200 and some lines of code. I mean, I know that we've added some stuff in, we've removed some stuff, but, we can cut that down to 30 some. I suppose there's some overhead at the top. But that's less code. We've shifted some of the code overhead to writing longer, more complicated test functions. When you're calling a simple overload, these were relatively simple. We would need more overloads and more options, because if we wanted to change the background, not change the background, you could see how that's going to multiply up to lots and lots of different overloads very, very quickly. So the option to that, as we've seen, is to pass in that class. Simply have one class that has all of the options, and then deal with the options inside that one function. And then also we've seen how we can simplify some of our text by using things like optional parameters and the initializing list, the initializer list, to shorten the amount of code that we have. So we've gone from, more code here to a little less. Let's get rid of these now dead lines of code here. So we've been able to break this down into arguably 3 lines instead of 6. But we shouldn't be really counting lines at this point. But anyway, so things I thought you should know. So let's go ahead and turn this over to Q&A. Greg Meach asks, can this entire modal window be made into a prefab, thus allowing you to instantiate it at runtime, perhaps making it into a singleton too? Yeah, you can, but to a degree, whether it's instantiated or not instantiated, or active or inactive, the one advantage of having it instantiated in the scene at start and then just activating it and deactivating it is you're not dealing with the overhead of instantiating and destroying. You're not dealing with any garbage collection. So it's a little bit like having a pool of one, that you've created your one instance of this modal window, and then you can turn it on and off, and you don't need more than one. So you don't need a pool, but it's a sort of a pool of one. And I'm reading that Janice Goose 7 says there are functions for making some functions inactive if you don't need them. Essentially, all of this system works only as you need it, because when we have our modal window up, if you've activated 3 buttons, you get 3 buttons. If you deactivate a button, you get 2. If you deactivate a button, you get 1. Now, arguably, this system as a modal window doesn't like to work with no buttons because you couldn't close it. If you found an alternative way to display the text without a button, you could have no buttons and make sure they were all turned off. But right now, the way the system has worked, you need at least 1 to be able to close that button. Same with that icon. is that the icon can be there or not, and as you turn it on and off, it will adjust. So that's partly why that this is designed the way that it is that it's somewhat of a generic system that you can send to it as much information as you need and have it behave as you want it to. And you could make 4. I mean, you don't need a limit of 3 buttons, and then you just need to make sure that if you want 4 buttons, that in your code, come on up, that you have a 4th button detail. And that you go ahead and you use that. And you'd need to then make sure that you had your button 4 details here as well. Yeah, I mean, we didn't explicitly, just to say this officially, Greg meets and then says, thanks, make it don't destroy, unload, missed the other sessions. But we don't explicitly go into don't destroy, unload, or how to carry it from scene to scene. But yes, you'd want to find some way to carry it from scene to scene or instantiate it once at the beginning of every scene. How you want to work that out for your game is up to you. Everyone's game is architected a little bit different, built a little bit differently. But yes, you can do that. GM Liquid Media, yes, you could. It depends how complicated that you want, but essentially the same style works. I mean, you might want to build that functionality into the window with another game object that you can turn on and turn off. So where are we? Modal dialog panel, that's the one we want. UI slider. And then now that you've got your UI slider, you'd want to address that here in your modal panel details. And then, to be able to turn it on and turn it off, you'd want some you might want slider details. I don't know. I haven't really thought this one through, but you could make a public class event slider details. And then, not sure quite what you'd want to do with it, but yeah, you could. I mean, it could be something that says, how loud do you want it? And then when you're done, you only have an OK button at the end. You just turn these off. I mean, so you could by manipulating this, get something that looks like this. I suppose the question would be is, when does manipulating one window into an infinite number of configurations become a point where you want your own custom window, and then you have 2? So then you have a modal dialog panel, and then you have a modal, audio panel that's got some sliders on it, or a settings panel that you have more infinite control on. But I think that would be up to you on how you wanted to run that. But it's entirely possible. Yeah, I mean, if you wanted to do settings or something like that, I'm not sure you'd want to use this particular panel. You might want to customize it a little bit more. Dame Fisto says, about the size, can it be instantiated with the percentages and set an order by layout? Yes. Definitely need to go back and look at the other 2 sessions, because we talk about how this one is popped to the front. There is a script that is bring to front, which is just simply on enable transform set last sibling. which puts it to the front, puts it at the bottom of the hierarchy. And if we look at the modal panel, we can see it's got bring to the front. So no matter what's been going on in the UI, when this modal panel is called, assuming it's only on, there's only this canvas. I mean, right now this is a single canvas thing. If there was multiple canvases, this would be popped to the end of this canvas. And if you had something that was another canvas on top, you could potentially make sure this could find out it was not on the top of the game. But assuming that we have one canvas in this case, that always brings the modal panel to the absolute top. Now, these are all, normal Unity style components. So you can affect the anchors, you can affect the rect transform in code. So if this isn't the right size and the right placement, you can, in your functions, you just have to make sure that you write it so that the modal panel can do something about it. Your modal panel.cs remember at this point we just have one function. New choice, is that if you're sending information, it needs to be resizable, whether that comes in as part of the modal panel details, or whether it's going to a separate function that's resizing it. You need to have something that is being sent from the function, the event in your game that's bringing up this dialog box. And then you need something on the modal panel itself that receives that information and then resizes or repositions that window. You could put on drag information too, is that if you look at panes, panels, and windows, we talk about hot zones for dragging things. So you could make this a draggable window as well. So even though it's still blocking everything, say you want to see what's underneath it, question, do you want to destroy this item and for some reason it's blocking it, or do you want to enter this dungeon? You can make this movable so that you can pick it up, move it out of the way, look through it and say yes or no. Lord Snake, 1988 says, how do you select the options with the controller? There is a navigation function with our buttons, which is currently, they're all set to automatic. Let me go ahead and turn these on. And let's go to our scene, and then let's go ahead and look at our button. And then we can go to visualize. And we can see this is the default visualization for using left, right, up, and down on the controllers. So you can navigate buttons and select it in highlight in controllers using the left, right, and up and down, like things like the hi-hats. And these are the order in which they will navigate to and from. And then you can make navigation different. Horizontal only, vertical only, not a big change. But if you go into explicit, you can start to set these specifically when you go into explicit. So you can go ahead, and most of them are set to automatic. It's a pretty good algorithm, so they go where you expect them to go. But if you need to, you can set where the up, down, and left, rights go from every UI element to every other selectable UI element. Yeah, and I'm seeing that Ovoshape is saying that Matt did cover the controllers. I believe they are covered in another session, but Couch Wars probably would have controllers. You can see now that I have added and moved this around that it changes the, oops, the navigation has been automatically updated as well. Picture Me Roland is asking about doing some live sessions on procedural terrain creation and procedural meshes and that sort of stuff. It is actually on our list. We have some other things that we want to do that are probably a bit more pressing. But it is something that I have been looking at both in 2D and in 3D. And also we are trying to keep it into an hour. Some of those sessions may turn into things that are on our website more persistently, because then we can work on them offline and they can go longer than an hour if they need to. There is a good, just to get started, there's I've been watching this one, and then procedural cave generation. This is a high candidate of becoming a community lesson that we're going to put on our website. But very fascinating, and his explanation. I've seen the first 3, and he explains things in a way that makes me envious of him as a teacher. He explains the way that the system works in the right amount of detail, so you don't get lost and you don't get bored for doing procedural caves. And he's got 7 episodes, may have 1 or 2 more. We'll see where that goes. But definitely, if you're looking into some procedural mesh generation, this is very fascinating. It's got some really good information in it. And someone who's in that shade of green I can never read, Rudolfo Rubens, is there any function that I can focus a specific game object so the navigation won't link the others that is not focused? I'm thinking, I don't quite understand yet. The UI auto navigation with the keyboard arrows. Yes, there is. I mean, you can specifically force something to have attention. What is that? Unity. I'm looking. I know you can. If you're saying, meaning in code, saying please focus on this particular object when you hit this, when this event happens, when this button is clicked. Select menu, selectable objects. That sounds correct. What Steak Pinball is saying is that sounds correct, but let's see if I can find it and see it in code. And selectable.select. Yeah, take a look at that. Thanks, Steak Pinball. Rudolfo Rubens says, when I show the modal window, I want only the modal window buttons can be selected. Yes, we've done that with a masking element. If you go back and look at the previous versions, you'll see it. But what we have here, if you look at the modal panel, and let me see, we've got this color. Let me just change the color to red. And then we can up its alpha. That is directly attached to the modal panel. And when the modal panel is instantiated, it has that bring to front. So it will take this modal panel and it'll make it the last object in the hierarchy. There we go. So that masking element that we have here, this image, is masking the entire rest of the game, so nothing below it will accept any input. And then if you go to a time scale, pause your game using the pause menu, so your game is paused, and the only thing that you can click on is the buttons that you've put up on the modal window. But we described that probably in the first episode. Interesting question, Lord Snake 1988 and Soylent Pete. Because yes, you can see that that's going here. Clearly that'll go underneath the modal window. So the solution to that would probably be you set your explicit mode to the buttons on the modal window to stay on the modal window. So if you set these to explicit, actually we've got this extra one. So let's just delete that one. So on the yes button, button 1, we want to go right. And it wants to be button 2. And then button 2, yeah, it wants to be left is button 1. And wants to be right is, oh, it's off screen, sorry guys, button 3. Yeah, so I mean, you could probably do that so this, you wouldn't be able to navigate off of this particular island because your left and rights would be explicitly set to a limited number of buttons. Oops. And then finally, button 4 would only go to button 3. So now, in theory, these are the only buttons that are available because you can't click on these. So you wouldn't be able to start a selection on any of these. And if you start off with a highlight on the yes button, or button 1, you shouldn't be able to get off of it. But I think the key to this would be making sure that you had a default button highlighted when you came into the modal panel, whether it was cancel or no, and that was your default button. And then once you're in that default button, you wouldn't be able to move off the island. Jidzik, sorry, I butchered your name, says, can this be used in a multiplayer game to display scores in a table while some button is held down? In this particular case, I'm not sure, Jidzik, that you would need to use a modal window for it, but you can simply pop up a panel with a high score in it, and I would look at panes, panels, and windows for the window, and then, as OboShape has said, look at the scrolling list at runtime, which you can use to populate that with, and that would be, let me just quickly grab those modules, live training archive, and then it would be the ones I would sort of suggest is using the UI tools. There we go. Panes, panels, and windows. And then lastly, UI scrolling menus at runtime. There we go. So that would be this and that. And that one. Okay, any last questions, like I said, or I'm gonna sign off. Anyway, gonna go off mic. Talk to you guys later.